Today I have the pleasure of talking about design education. The importance of design thinking is really the theme. Now, being involved with teaching design, I am engaged daily in this activity of talking about what it means to do design. And if we read the title, Innovation in Architecture, Pre-Knowledge and Intuition in Design, then those two aspects allow us to think about the design keywords at the bottom of this page. Creativity, disegno, which is the Latin root of the word design, I'll come to that. Embodied knowledge, imagination, innovation, insight, intuition, and pre-knowledge. And today I want to take out those last two terms, intuition and pre-knowledge, and talk about them as the basis for what we do when we speak about design in all fields. And then I'll come to architecture as a specific field, and the field that has guided me through the past 30 years of looking for inspiration in culture. I'll first share my journey in studying design through architecture, and in the second part I will draw a parallel between the design innovation found in the vernacular world versus the attitude implied and imposed often by global development. So part one, if we think about this quote by Henry Poincaré, he says, "It is through science that we prove, but through intuition that we discover." So the second part of the phrase is what I'm going to trace through a series of stories about architecture. And the first one would be to think about Filippo Brunelleschi, was the architect of the dome of the Florence Cathedral. And when he won the commission to build the Dome of Florence in around 1419, legend has it that he brought an egg to the council to win the competition and said, "Anyone that can make this egg stand on a table without falling over, I challenge, and I can do that. And if I do that, will you give me the commission to build the dome on the cathedral?" And supposedly he took the egg, and a raw egg, not a cooked egg, and put it on the table in such a way that he flattened the bottom of it out and said, "That's my image for the dome." Now, that's one thing. He got the commission, and in being able to cap the medieval structure and then do that over the course of the next 25 years, he had to invent several machines. It's famous, the Dome of Florence Cathedral, because it didn't have any scaffolding or centering below, which was unheard of. And in inventing all the machines to bring material up, and he changed the way the entire process of working in Florence happened at that time, he made this analogy between the egg and managed to build it now at a much bigger scale. And it still is one of the prides of the Renaissance in working. The key to that is that Brunelleschi was trained in the guild as a jeweler and a goldsmith. So being able to go from that scale of something very small as jewelry and then tackling the largest piece of construction from that time till modern times, that's really the source of innovation. And I'm going to trace that idea through several other examples. So now if we think about the word disegno, disegno is the term meaning to mark, to trace out, to order, to plan, to outline, or describe. So all of these have to do with the visual and synthetic nature of design. So when we speak about making a design of any kind that we've been seeing today in the talks, it really is to be able to kind of make a plan or an outline or a mark or inscribe something. That idea has to be translated through some visual form. Now if we think further about the term design, quotes, the internet is full of quotes on design, and a couple of them that would be useful for us is the first, design is the conscious effort to impose a meaningful order. So that's an interesting one, to think about the idea of order in all design. Another, design is intelligence made visible. And a third, design, the ability to invent innovative solutions to complex problems. So certainly design and architecture is about the search for order, and in this sense, it's linked to creation and to creation myths. Every act of human design is, in a sense, connected to the profound sense of deriving order from chaos through creation. Such a definition of design quickly transcends mere functional problem solving, say getting 40 people into a classroom. That's not the fullness of the nature of the origin of what design means at its root. To make a sketch for an architect, and a sketch by any means, whether you draw it, make a collage, work at whatever media, that making of a sketch is the full-on version of this complex symbolic activity that we call design. In a world of complexity and involving multidimensional bits of information, where you have a site, a client, materials, the culture, the weather conditions, in architecture, the budget. It's through the design that these quite independent layers of a given design problem literally take shape. So that all these bits of information become synthetically translated through this act of design. But we use the word often in a kind of generic way without actually taking each of those subwords and understanding that in that process, there's a whole series of things that go on that are rational as well as irrational. An architect's sketch is an idea given form that will unfold in time and eventually lead to a built form. This intuitive and evolutionary process is akin, in my mind, I've always thought about the analogy with a quarterback receiving the ball and at the same time knowing how to throw the ball downfield to an imaginary point in space, at which time a player will arrive under the arc of the throw with precision, and those two things coincide. They have to be mapped out, and it's not a rational process, of course, in that way, but the analogy is there about understanding how things unfold in time, in design. So if the process of design is nonlinear, and we've certainly heard a lot about that today, that it's lateral thinking, drawing from different sources. If it's nonlinear, evolutionary in time, and iterative, meaning that we do many versions of things, not just one, is it not closer to magic than it is to logic design? It really isn't a completely rational process. That's why there's no textbook. We can't say, read this book on design and you'll become a good designer. It's actually a much more complex process, but in order to tease it out through education, I think Poincaré noted correctly that it's through intuition that we discover, and that this sense of discovery is the thrilling part about design. So what does it mean to say that we teach design? Helping students to cultivate their intuition and to rely on their pre-knowledge is endlessly rewarding. Since architecture is a visual art, as designers we see and interpret the world through drawing, modeling, and other visual forms. As an iterative process, design options are one way for the design process to synthesize information and to display various possibilities, since there is always more than one solution to a given design problem. And that's a great thing to look at if you trace somebody's work and you see that very rarely in design do you come up with the solution the first time, but in many, many options, it's a way of seeing that this set of information has one possibility and another and another, and then another process of design is discernment and deciding to see what designs to bring forward. So at its origin, design thinking is therefore engaged at the highest level of strategic problem solving. As the mind of the designer takes shape, embodied knowledge, meaning things that we have experienced and are therefore at our fingertips, and pre-knowledge, things that we know about before we formally study them, forms our foundation of human perception. While many authors have opposed intuition to empirical forms of perception, in teaching design, I have never found the distinction to be so clear. Intuition, like pre-knowledge, is a form of insight that, apparently hidden, often pops suddenly into consciousness. The Academy continues to speak about intuition in dismissive ways, but for a designer, listening to and even cultivating intuition as a working method is essential. Intuition may even be considered a very high form of intelligence in the areas of strategic thinking and decision-making. And as intuition enters into the design process, at some point becoming insight, and literally that word again is where we see deeply into things and have sight penetrate and at a certain moment understand the gist of a problem, we often experience a eureka moment that you found it. Think of Einstein's image, for instance, of riding upon a beam of light until the light bends. That's one of those images that when he describes, allows us to see that he himself was suddenly having a moment where that image crystallized and then he was able to move forward in the realm of physics. So first, the ghost of an idea is somewhere on the periphery of our perception, and suddenly, aha, I found it. Every designer has had this experience many, many times, where it's a kind of inkling, and that intuitive pre-knowledge that's at the source of that is important to cultivate throughout our lives. How else would Brunelleschi have thought about an egg as the form for his dome? That was one of those kind of intuitive ideas that then he spends the next 20 years detailing, mapping out, making more complex. So I'm describing this at length to illustrate that the act of design involves all of the keywords on the screen, which is perhaps what we mean when we say to students that design involves a process of complex, multidimensional problem solving. We know that when an architect makes a sketch, it involves all of his or her pre-knowledge, embodied knowledge, and intuition. One mystery largely remains, though. How does pre-knowledge become part of the conscious process of design? Well, when I began the study of architecture some 30 years ago, very little attention was paid to intuition or pre-knowledge as sources of design. In fact, such attributes were actively discouraged as irrational. 4 points. One, the teacher said on the first day when we started architecture school together, sitting in the audience like yourselves, they said, look to the person on your left. In 1 year, they'll be gone. So this created a sense of military fear, absolutely non-creative. Second, critiquing the student along with the work. Or even worse, making fun of the student, collapsing the work with the student. And in my case, in first year, someone actually committed suicide as a result of that, confusing the student and making fun of them instead of talking about the design work, because they coincided. But you can see why. In a creative field, like all the design arts, there is a very personal sense of all of our work being put on the floor, on the wall, and as we talk about it, there has to be a respect to really separate the student from the work, and this was absolutely not there when I was in school. Third one, studying history in books, removing architecture from its phenomenal and sensory context. This never made sense to me, but in taking courses, eventually I was able to then realize by going and visiting buildings and studying them and being in sight with them, it changed the way I absolutely approached teaching later on. And fourthly, studying technology by drawing things without any direct experience of them. Say a window frame assembly drawn from a book, rather than first visiting a window factory, understanding how a window's made, and then drawing it. It produces a very different result. I was also told in first year of architecture school to forget everything I learned till now in order to learn the language of architecture, which is ridiculous when you think about it, but it was very much thought that somehow if you could erase all your experience and then learn this other language, you would become an architect. But the question is, what's the source of that other language? To add to this dilemma, most teachers in architecture schools across North America have never taken not a single course on teaching or studied in an education department. Most design studio instructors are teaching from their own intuitive understanding of what they learned and what they feel, which makes the disconnect with personal experience all the more ironic. Now, let's approach the design and the problem of design thinking in reverse. Imagine learning design with an emphasis on pre-knowledge, intuition, and direct experience. If you just had those three things, let's actually come at design from respecting what those things mean. This type of embodied knowledge takes us back to drawing upon, and building upon things we know, rather than calling upon things we don't know directly. So, say a student has a knowledge of hunting with his grandfather. Another student has memories of the smell of grapes from her parents' wine cellar in the basement, and a third loves to paddle in the calmness of the lake. These are all embodied experiences that have everything to do with how one will approach design in the present. A nice anecdote that puts this in situ is the French artist Jean Cocteau tells a very poetic story about returning to his village in France when he was about 60. And he says, as I'm walking along this stone wall and I can see my grandmother's house in the distance, I run my finger along the stone wall, and he said, and I'm puzzled because I'm actually not feeling the memories of when I was there as a child. And at a certain moment, he puts his hand lower down and says, now I trace the wall along the mortar joint at the height where I was 10 years old, and suddenly, he says, like a needle in a record, the flood of memories, the smell of my grandmother's cooking, memories of playing in the sunflower fields, this entire world came back to him in one moment as an embodied memory. So that's an example of the importance, I think, of understanding direct experience. As I progressed through architecture school, I began traveling the world to experience architecture in context, with its site, its colors, its weather, its culture. In so doing, my wonder increased of the many stories or narratives underlying each building that were left out of the images and text in the book. The most advanced architecture, of course, is impossible to photograph in a single image because it's much more complex, and with all of those layers of creative work in play, one has to really spend time with architecture and understand them much more as storytelling than as images in isolation. Architecture's multiplicity, therefore, takes time to experience and to interpret. This image I owe to a professor friend named Essie, and for 25 years we've been talking about the implications of this image. It's a child being placed by its mother in a field. They're about to work up on the top part of the image, And we were several meters behind watching this woman carry her child, had wrapped it beautifully in this white cloth, and then found this place in the earth, studied it for a while, and then found this layer that you can see almost like a natural cradle. The earth is there to protect. The child is wrapped and put down carefully. And then the mother took this branch and bent it from the roadside to provide shelter and covering from the sun. And then when she and the other women are working in the fields in rural Peru, they can watch over their children and actually see them and guard them, but understand this is the kind of initial shelter. It's a beautiful image because it actually captures in it this sense of what dwelling is. And in a way, for many years I've thought about this image as we then say, design a room, or think about a house, or what does it mean to be made to feel welcome. It's the kind of primal gesture, in a very archetypal way, that is intuitive on her part, but sets everything up for the experience of that child laying there in the comfort of the shade with its mother nearby. So, that image is important because without being formally trained, a highly similar creative process can be found in the way that people in all parts of the world design the things that they use. So at one level, we have teaching design in schools. At another level, there's this creativity that abounds with intuition and pre-knowledge in all cultures. And as I've traveled and been able to kind of see that as the source for then coming back to teach design, it's been incredibly rewarding. And as I say, it has to do a lot with storytelling and spending time in places and seeing the creative energy and innovation that exists in all parts of the world and fold that back into school. That brings me to the central point of this talk. Everyone in the world designs, since the unique thing about human creativity is that it cannot be held back. We are hardwired for ingenuity, problem solving, and insight, even through play, maybe especially through play. Through play and mimesis, children begin to make sense of their environment, designing along the way. For instance, I have twins, and one of my children, sees us on the phone and starts to play with a play phone. And then, in the absence of a play phone, she'll use the piece of toast as a phone. So that's already a fairly interesting act of design. And then in the absence of real talk, they'll talk baby talk, but they'll speak to me on a real phone on the piece of toast. Right? That's the kind of creativity that I actually think is important to carry on as we move through the system. And especially with twins, because there's a whole twin language that mimics our language but is their own. And it's quite humiliating to have two 20-month-olds have a conversation and laugh at you and you don't know what they're saying. Especially when you're a teacher, because we're sensitive to these things. While this type of action in childhood is clearly paving the way for creativity and innovation in later years, sadly, much of our education system that follows does not reinforce the type of intuitive activities that lead to design. Picasso observing the bicycle seat and handlebars as being able to be recombined as the head of a bull is a classic example of design thinking. Creativity, imagination, and insight begin to build up our picture of the world through embodied knowledge. These two images are a recent picture from a friend of an Indian man cooking on the street in Rajasthan. And on the right is a drawing I made in Calcutta a number of years ago that drew all the vehicles on a single road in Calcutta. Because the question is, how do they all operate? They managed to move around 12 kilometers an hour, but one of the great things in that situation, it's in plan, right? So you can see that people in plan, someone carrying the 2x4s on their shoulder, trucks, a camel on the top right, next to a cow, next to a Volkswagen, next to a cart with a horse, and then bicycle versions of rickshaws and things that look like a rat in that drawing, but they're actually meant to be dogs. All of those things move along the same way. And what's great is that they're synthetically, like an analogy for design, all together. In the image on the left, the man, if you see, actually has his little place set up on the street to sell bread, but his bicycle is visible, the handlebars of the bicycle in the distance and the wheel in the foreground. So his bike that he brings the objects to along the street also becomes part of the table as he sets things up, and then the can is cut out to make a place for cooking the bread. So all of those things are an act of design. Right? And they come together, and they're creative, and they're largely intuitive. But in the vernacular world, I actually feel that this sense of wonder and reutilization of materials and all of that is highly developed. So people, very famous architects, have done projects where they took, for instance, all of those elements on the road and then separated them out. Le Corbusier did a project for Chandigarh, and he had 8 different roads to separate out traffic of different kinds. So that's a kind of metaphor for not understanding the intuitive, synthetic quality of design. All those things belong all together, and that's the magic of it, and when you separate them out, you really lose that sense. Now, why did that happen? I would argue in this talk that since President Harry Truman first invoked the term development in his inaugural address of 1949, the so-called First World has been conducting development business much the same way that I initially experienced design education. Truman noted, and in cooperation with other nations, we should foster capital investment in areas needing development. Instead of individual students being told to forget what they know and ignore their intuition, this time entire vernacular cultures were informed overnight that they were undeveloped and should leave behind their established ways of doing things. Many countries eventually began to believe this, and as we developed them, they were forced to erase their cultural traditions and collective intuition. Truman's method of investment first required the creation of scarcity, lacking in certain resources. Once the perception of scarcity was established, the new Western materials and processes would help develop the world's people to some shared standard for a better life. However, in the process, complete denial of the informal sector, the loss of metaphoric thinking, the stoppage of the tradition of gift-giving, were all indicators that poor countries' GNPs were rising to an acceptable standard. But in the process, they were losing the complexity that I show on the screen. And so the story of 20th century colonization found its way through capitalism to development. The benefits of the West continued to grow. It's been estimated that for every US dollar invested, something like $47 has been earned in return. So it wasn't an altruistic process. Critic Ivan Illich reminded all of us to question our assumptions, a lesson I haven't forgotten as a designer. Earlier we heard about stepping outside of labels, and this is one of those, questioning the assumptions of a place that we visit. So, these people don't own houses, but are they poor in spirit, I would ask? So these people don't follow our Western division of time, but they live in cyclical time, so which system is more comprehensive? So these people don't divide their land into individual lots for ownership, and so on. Books such as John Turner's Housing by People and Illich's Deschooling Society critically examined our assumptions about the haves and have-nots. Their work led me to argue for people maintaining control over local technologies. We documented and recorded squatter towns searching for their order, their social cohesion, and particularly the resourcefulness of people in designing places when actual scarcity exists. Slowly, the arrow began to point in the reverse direction. How resourceful are we? What is our resilience in the face of a storm or a blackout? How large is our carbon footprint? And whatever happened to gift-giving as a sign of economic prosperity, as outlined in The Gift by Marcel Mauss? So I'll end on two examples. The first one to think about is the Bhutan's Gross National Happiness Index that you probably heard of. It's an interesting example. Instead of just measuring GNP as an economic indicator, to actually make the matrix they've made to look at well-being and happiness. And the second one are these images from the Hong Kong Bank, the HSBC building in Hong Kong, the building in the middle. When it was finished in 1985 by Norman Foster, it was the high-tech building in the world, and it has this plaza that you move through to get to the old Star Ferry terminal in Hong Kong. So that's the plaza when it's more or less in the working hours, a few people going up to the escalator to get to the main floor of the bank. But on Sundays, the great thing about this building is that it's the place where the Filipino nannies and workers get together and they have their Sunday gathering. And as you can see from the images, it's dense, it's very people, they put cardboard down, they bring food, and they actually turn it into a place that is actually a public place for them. It wasn't designed this way. So the point I'll close on for the talk is that the language of design is by definition metaphoric. This plaza is a lobby to the bank, but at the same time a Filipino social space on Sundays. In architecture, each thing is itself as well as a reference to something else, producing multiple meanings. So my message in the talk is simple. To all young innovators and entrepreneurs, if innovation is creativity applied to solve a specific problem, continue to draw upon your deepest intuition and pre-knowledge as sources, and your creative design voice can't help but emerge. Thank you.